Thanks for having us today. Yeah, I just want to say a couple things about, some of the new technology that Smart to Move has at this point. One of the most unbelievable force plate systems we use with all of our players we work with out on tour. All of our data collections come through this system. I mean, it wasn't a few years ago that you didn't have to build an entire studio or lab to get force data. Now it fits in a carry-on suitcase, and it's something that we can do very easily on the road with a lot of players. So we're going to go through a couple different things here today. I'm going to do a couple little basic overviews of kind of the philosophy of how we look at ground force here at Super Speed, some of the protocols that we like to use with our players, and then I really want to jump into doing some really cool case study work with everybody. We've got a number of tour ambassadors at Super Speed, probably headlined by Padraig Harrington, and I want to show you kind of what we saw with him middle part of last year, which may surprise you for the player that led the Champions Tour in driving distance and honestly was hitting high 170s in ball speed when we started, and I want to show you what we got after. Also, a very interesting case on the LPGA Tour of a player that's seen a lot of gain in her speed and in her career in the last year, and that's Cheyenne Knight. Maybe some of the most interesting ground force data that we've ever seen on the LPGA Tour, and a recent player that we started working with last year named Maxwell Moldovan, who plays at Ohio State right now, will be turning pro end of this year, who saw some huge gains in just a short amount of time doing some of the right kind of drills for ground reaction force. So let's go ahead and get into this. First thing that I would look at is, at Super Speed Golf, we look at swing mechanics in general as kind of a holistic concept that we call the speed pyramid. So this really looks at how a player is interacting with the ground, how those forces and torques created are going to influence the body rotationally, how that rotational sequencing is eventually going to translate out the arms and club, and hopefully right into the golf ball to max out club speed. So I think it's a good way to think about how all of these things connect together, because I think we can really get caught in the minutia sometimes of diving way too far into just looking at how that player's using the ground, or just how they're sequencing, or just how they're lagging the club into the ball, when really all of those things need to work together in the best way possible for that player to really create optimal club speed. So just as a little overview, if a lot of you around don't have a lot of experience with looking at ground reaction forces, it's probably a review for most people, but some of the things that we really look at when we're looking at all of these vectors rolling around in graphs, we're really looking at how big are these forces. We call that magnitude. How big is that force vector? We're looking at the direction or line of action that force is moving, because the force is going to influence the body in a certain direction, and we're also looking at where it's coming from, or point of application. When we put those things together and we have a good idea of how big a force is, which direction it's moving, and where it's coming from, we can have a really good idea of how to then coach that player to improve the efficiency of those forces. Now, in a very basic sense, we look at something called the kinetic sequence, and we've seen this pattern with just about every high-level player that we've ever tested, where we have lateral force being created first, and I really like to look at this specifically as trail foot lateral force, or how that golfer is pushing away from the ball with their right foot. That reaction force is then pushing the player toward the target, and we're going to have that kind of motion of lateral plane force pushing away from the target, the reaction force pushing the player toward the target. The next one we like to look at is confusing in the world of golf instruction, but it's called torque. Really, here we're looking at how does the lead foot push toward the ball, how does the trail foot push away from the ball. That resulting force couple creates what we call torque, which is going to help the body rotate. That's a big deal for a lot of players. We're also a rotational sport. The last one in that sequence that peaks is typically what we call vertical force. And here we're going to look at vertical force combined, but also coming out of how the lead foot of that player is creating vertical force. We've seen that to be very highly correlative to speed in what we're looking at. All right. let's get into these case studies. I think that's the fun thing to look at. And I really think it's probably the most valuable part of what we're doing. How does this actually get used in application out in the real world with players that are trying to do this for a living and also amateur players that are trying to get to that next level? The first one that I want to talk about is an LPGA Tour player named Cheyenne Knight. Now, a little background on Cheyenne. Cheyenne played at the University of Alabama, was an All-American, came out on tour, had some early success. Had a couple years where she didn't have a win, and we met with her, I want to say this was in May of last year. Cheyenne started out from a club speed standpoint at about 88, 89 miles an hour with her driver, ball speed of about 128. Now, she's working really hard to even get to that point. I'm looking at it and saying, I mean, something wrong with this. This is Scotty Scheffler's 6-iron. Like, we got to fix this. We got to get better, because this is a player that has won on the LPGA Tour, being in the bottom 30% of driving distance, and every other aspect of her game is firing on all cylinders. I don't know that I've ever heard a more pure wedge shot. I've seen players short games from all over the world, and I mean, I'm telling you, this girl can get up and down from anywhere. She's a great putter, and she's had to be, right? Because she's not out there with the ability to make 15 birdies around. I love working with those kind of players, and I love working with those kind of players on speed, because those kind of players, if they get just a little more speed and they get into the middle of the pack, all of a sudden it's like the floodgates open for them. So I want to show you some of the things that we saw with Cheyenne right off the bat. First thing I want to show you is point of application of what we were seeing with the way she was creating lateral force in her swing. And that's really on this side here, but if you see where that red dot is, pretty far to the outside of her foot, she was a player that was definitely kind of getting behind the ball a little too much and letting a little bit too much pressure get toward the outside of that foot. So we're seeing a point of application a little too far out. When we look at her lateral force production, we're seeing about 15% of body weight, but even though we're seeing that 15% of body weight, and I'd like to see more than that, I'd really love to see that be up in the 20 plus range. The way she's doing it, she doesn't create a lot of force for a lot of time. So that's something we call impulse. We'll talk about that a little later, but she's not getting a lot of total force production from that trail foot. This gets kind of crazier, so this is her torque number, and it's happening at a good point. In the downswing, this is where we want it, about 100%. That's just not enough here. And if you ask Cheyenne, how do you create power? How are you trying to create power? She would tell you that her goal is to create as much rotation as hard as she possibly can. So this is what she's trying to do to create speed, okay? We're not getting enough quite out of there in the torque side. Vertical force is really interesting here. Now, total combined vertical force of 168% for Cheyenne in her situation. I wasn't shocked that it was a little low. It's not crazy low, but it was a little low. What's very interesting here is Cheyenne's actually creating more vertical force from her trail foot at peak than she is from her lead foot. Now, that's very atypical for what you see with a lot of players. And this really comes from a desire for Cheyenne. One of the goals that she had is she is trying to figure out how to make the ball roll as far as possible. She's trying to figure out how to almost beat physics, and say, okay, I'm going to launch this thing at 7 or 8 degrees with no spin. And a lot of the shots that we saw would carry like 210, 212 yards and roll 30 or 40 yards if she's in a situation where that's a tight lie on the fairway. She's trying to maximize roll. That's how she's trying to get distance right now. This is kind of a result of that goal that she's trying to put into play in her game. Now, another concept that happens when we get into this situation where we don't have as much force coming off the lead side, we're a little lacking in total lateral force production. We've got a lot of these different situations that we need to really work on here, is we end up in a situation where she's going to be reducing other types of torque in her swing. One of those specifically is a concept we call moment arm when we're looking at it in physics. Now, this is a really key point, because moment arm for a player like Cheyenne is the only chance she has to create a ton of downswing loading and get a bunch of speed out of the transition of her golf swing. What this is, if we're trying to create torque with the upper body, you've all tried to like open a bolt or something, and you have like a little tiny wrench and it's almost impossible. And then you get like the long torque wrench and you have more distance, so it's really easy then to open that wrench. Pretty simple formula. If we apply 10 pounds of force to a 6-inch or half-foot wrench, we're going to get 5 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, we can do one of two things to increase the amount of torque we're going to get. We can either increase the amount of force we're producing. So if I could apply 40 pounds of force instead of 10, I'm going to get 20 pounds of torque instead of 10. Now, for a player like Cheyenne, do we think she's going to be able to apply 4 times the amount of force to the golf club in transition? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think that's the best way to go about it. And you'll see how I circle back on this in a second, because this is force we're looking at about applying to the club, but it's affected by how we do it with the ground. The other option is we figure out a way to make the wrench bigger. So if I can now apply 10 pounds of force to a 2-foot-long wrench, I get that same increase as if I were going to be applying 4 times as much force. So let's look at what this looks like in the swing. Here's an example of a player that does a very good job creating moment arm in his swing. This is Cody Blick. He's on the Korn Ferry Tour. Lateral force on the trail foot looking kind of like that is a vector. Vertical force looking a lot like that is a vector, okay? If I take the resultant force of that, you're gonna see it pushing toward the target significantly and pretty high, right? If I take his center of mass and I draw an imaginary line in 3D to that force vector, that's the size of the wrench for Cody. So if you look at a player like Cody Blick or John Rahm or a lot of these players, they're going to tell you, and the club feels like a feather when I'm trying to transition. It feels really light. It's really easy to do. That has to do with this mechanical advantage they're getting from this long moment arm. Let's see what Cheyenne's looked like with her situation we saw in some of those forces where she's getting a lot of vertical off the trail side. So first of all, this is actually what her force vectors look like, at this point in the swing and transition. So we got lateral force going a lot more up, right? It's not going toward the target, the trail foot's going more up. Vertical force is actually pushing back a little bit, and it's not very big, right? So her resultant force is coming right up through her body. Well, if we extend that out and make that moment arm, Cheyenne's got that like 2-inch wrench that's going on. And this was interesting, as we interviewed her and we're talking to her about it, she came up and she's like, yeah, I feel like I am doing absolutely everything in my power to make that club change direction. And she's like, I feel like I'm swinging as hard as I possibly can to make it happen. It's just not going. And we're like, well, obviously we didn't do that. This is not what you do with a tour player. You're like, well, Cheyenne, it's obvious. Obviously you don't have a large enough moment arm. There's this, you got to lay that force down. She'd probably look at us and go crazy. What we did is we gave her some very simple drills. In our side, we're going to try to make the forces bigger. That's great, right? But I need this lateral force vector to be going more toward the target, because that's going to make this resultant force come out here like we saw with Cody. And I want to see a whole lot more vertical force coming off the lead leg, okay? Here's her actual program that we built for her, again, like April, May of last year. We had her doing some very cool drills. One was skaters. Skaters, if you've seen, is like a lateral bounding drill where you're focused on landing on the inside of your foot, especially on that trail side. We did a step back drill, which is in all of our level 2 super speed protocol, where you kind of counter swing forward, step back, plant, swing, and go. Again, a lateral force drill, trying to get all of that going. Did some force pedal work on the trail foot. So got a force pedal under the inside heel of her trail foot, having her smash down into that as she's swinging back. Did both force pedals, trail, inside heel, and lead ball. That's kind of starting to get into those work on getting the lead ball of the foot working more in vertical force. Lead leg jump backs are a force pedal drill. I'll put it under the lead foot. Actually have the player jump and leave the ground before the club gets through impact, which seems crazy and wild, but it works really, really well. And then an application drill, just trying to apply those feels to the actual golf swing. All of these drills are going to be in our new super speed ground reaction force protocols. We have 3 levels of those coming soon with our app that's going to be releasing here in a couple months. So that's Cheyenne's program. So we kind of left her go for a while. She had some really great success. The overall success has been fantastic. She's gained over 10 miles an hour of ball speed at this point, put her in that like 140 range, which we still want more, but that's certainly less behind the 8 ball in the LPGA Tour. Got a win last year, which was a really fun event. Had a 2-0-1 record in the Solheim Cup, and just finished 4th last week here in Orlando. So, I think if there's any place in the world where 10 miles an hour of ball speed is going to make a huge difference in a career, LPGA Tour is the place. Let's see, though, what changed. Because one of the things that we always do with our players at Super Speed is we're always test the drills that we give them before we let them go off and work on them, which seems like an obvious thing to a lot of people that know what they're doing coaching, but you'd be shocked how many people don't do this. Well, we tested all of these drills and said, okay, what's going to change? And this is going to be data from about a half hour after we worked on this stuff, about a half hour, retested. Here's what we got. Well, lateral force went up to 18%. Doesn't seem like a lot, but that's a 20% gain in lateral force in 30 minutes. That's a big deal. We then looked at torque. Because that lateral force was able to move more, everything else is going to exponentially get better. We got her, we basically freed her up for the ability to be able to start to now create rotational torque, which is how she wanted to create power in the first place. That's a 40% gain in rotational torque. Vertical went up to a total of 187%, and we started to get a bigger percentage of that going from the lead leg. Okay, I think that's the key here, is I just wanted the lead side to be more than the trail. So once I saw that, I was like, okay, great job, all this is going, off to the races, work on this program. So that's kind of where we are with Cheyenne. She's doing fantastic. Lateral force in this case, and point of application of lateral force, essentially allowed the other forces to work better for her in her swing. So without really even attacking those, they got a lot better. So it's a chain reaction with all this. The kinetic sequence chain reaction of this is the most important part in coaching ground reaction force.